go to college. And so the first year, their scores were not very good. The second year, their scores were not very good. And the third year, he sent out a letter to the kids and he said, we're not going to have a ninth grade next year. Goodbye. He threw the entire class out. But they don't mention that in the way to keep school man. So the bottom line here is there's a very, very powerful movement. It's all generals, no troops. It's all the people you saw on Education Nation if you watched that NBC fest about all the problems and you know, reiterating the Superman solutions of privatization and testing. There are a lot of generals. They don't have troops. The troops are the parents, the troops are the teachers, the troops are the administrators, the troops are the people who care about public education, the troops are the people who understand that public education is one of the most fundamental institutions in a democratic society. People in this country don't want to privatize their public schools, and it's happening. And it's happening because it has the support of the Gates Foundation, Broad Foundation, the Obama administration, a lot of very wealthy hedge fund managers. I encourage you to look up something on Google called DFER Watch, D-F-E-R Watch. DFER is Democrats for Educational Reform. This is a group of hedge fund managers who control billions of dollars, and they have been investing in political campaigns across the country to advance the pro-charter agenda. Now, I hasten to add, I would love to support charter schools, but I would love to support charter schools that help and collaborate with public education, not compete with it and seek to undermine it. So, my message to you is, if I know that Washington State is one of the few that has not adopted charter legislation. As things now stand, you cannot allow the same group of privatizers, because it's like the camel's nose under the tent. They will come in and they will seek aggressively to compete with the public schools, to skim kids off in neighborhoods where they can, and to say we're better than you are, we deserve more money, we deserve more kids, we deserve more charters. And this weakens public education. The very nature of public education is that it is a public responsibility. It's not just for the kids who are the leftovers in charters. I probably talked too long, but let me just mention one of the panels on the NBC Education Bash. It was called The Lessons of New Orleans. Does American education need a Hurricane Katrina? But that was a pretty disgusting question. And bloggers, I mean, the internet is very powerful. Bloggers all over the country were so outraged at the idea that they were actually echoing something Arnie Duncan once said. Arnie Duncan said that Katrina was the best thing that ever happened to the public school system in New Orleans. Well, let's not mention the fact that a lot of people died and a lot of people lost everything they owned. But what it did to the public education system was it wiped it out. And so what New Orleans has now is 60% of its children in charter schools, and 40% of the kids in the other schools, and the charter schools don't want them. The 40% who are not in the charter schools fail the state test at very high rates, and they're the ones that charter schools don't want to expand to take. This is a two-track, two-tier system. It's not public education. Protect your public education, improve it, make it better. It needs to be far better than it is today, but work to make it the best it can possibly be, and don't let the privatizers win. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ravitch. Now we continue on with our panel, and next up will be Professor Wayne Powell. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. This is really nice for me to be here. I left Seattle a little over 10 years ago, and come here and see a lot of just old friends in the audience, and also just to reconnect with, and also just to make some new connections as well. So it really feels good to be home. Diane, I do bring regards from James Banks and Michael Apple, so if you're still there, hopefully you're that.
I'm here.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, your video left.
No, I'm face away just so not to distract from what you're saying.
Okay. And so, I have about 10 to 15 minutes to just talk, and I'm going to pose a question to you. And I think we're going to wait till the end before she takes time to answer all these questions. Is that correct? Okay. All right. So I just prepared 3 remarks. Tonight, I'm angry. I'm angry that the movie Waiting for Superman, with its half-truths and shallow analysis and misinformation, is getting so much press. I'm angry that President Obama, with his continual vocal support of neoliberal education, neoliberal education reform, seems to have betrayed public education. I'm angry that all these businessmen, like Gates and Walton and Broad and the Business Roundtable, and now Zuckerberg and Facebook, that all these fat cats have so much influence over the direction of our public schools, when in reality they have no clue about what constitutes quality public education. I'm angry that Arnie Duncan has equated this moment in educational reform with its stated focus on using high-stakes standardized testing to close racial achievement gaps as his, quote, Rosa Parks moment, unquote. As if such testing equates with the civil rights movement. I'm also angry at the LA Times and policymakers for even attempting to advance the idea that high-stakes standardized tests can be used to accurately measure student learning and teacher effectiveness. And this is what I want to focus my remarks on tonight. Some of the pernicious problems with high-stakes testing, and it should actually fill in, I'm going to actually add some of the research that you made reference to already there. First, I want to address the historic relationship between testing and inequality. Obama and Duncan continue to voice their support for pay-for-performance plans and using high-stakes tests to evaluate teachers, all under the guise of promoting educational equality. In the midst of such high-minded rhetoric, I think it's critical that we recognize the simple fact that standardized tests have always reproduced inequality in this country. The history of standardized testing in the U.S. is basically this. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, U.S. psychologists essentially misused tests developed by the French psychologist Alfred Binet. Binet developed his test as a tool for early childhood educators to look for potential mental disabilities in very young children. U.S. psychologists like Goddard and Terman and Yerkes took this test, as well as Binet's concept of IQ, which stands for intelligence quotient, and inappropriately applied it to adults. In the early 1900s, these U.S. psychologists tested the masses of new Army recruits, and it should become to no surprise that their supposedly objective results came up with this. Poor people were less intelligent than rich people. Darker Southern European immigrants were less intelligent than their lighter Northern European counterparts, and African Americans came out as the least intelligent of them all. These test results mainly reflected the social order of the times, and they were used to great effect. First, the results went a long way to justify existing inequalities. According to the test, poor people were poor because they were dumber. Same with African Americans or anyone else who scored low on the test. Second, these test scores helped instantiate the idea that intelligence was biologically inherited. Third, because the results reflected the social order, they also lent substance to the growing eugenics movement, which among other beliefs asserted that women, people of color, and the poor were genetically inferior to men, whites, and the rich, respectively. Today, however, we see standardized tests used within a very different political context. Instead of being used to justify social and educational inequality, they're held up as a tool in the fight for equality. The irony is that when we look at the results of standardized tests today, we see the same thing. Working class kids and kids of color consistently do more poorly than their affluent and white counterparts. I have to repeat this point because it's a point that I think we really need to consider. Is the year 2010, and our standardized tests, by and large, produce the same damn results they did 100 years ago. In the end, after all of my research and analysis of high-stakes standardized testing and the 100 years of evidence, I think that educators, policymakers, and the public need to fully acknowledge the racist and classist history of standardized tests, and they further need to open up to the idea that high-stakes standardized tests might actually measure something other than learning. We would instead do better to understand that these tests are a stronger indicator of socioeconomic relations more than anything else. That they're really good. that they are really good at measuring the relative status of social groups, and that they are not so good at accurately measuring individual student learning and teacher effectiveness. Which really begs the question, can we realistically use tests that consistently reproduce social inequality as a tool to fix inequality? This brings me to the other main point I want to raise regarding the use of high-stakes standardized tests in current education reforms. These tests cannot and should not be used to handle the job of measuring student learning or teacher effectiveness. So let's look at a little bit of evidence. And I apologize, I'm gonna run some stats, but without the visuals. So hopefully I won't lose you as I run this out. So here's some pieces of evidence, and you're right, Diane, it's never been evidence, it's always politics and ideology that are running things. Here's some evidence as to why we cannot use tests to measure student learning or teacher effectiveness. One, I hope everyone here knows that there was a recent Department of Education report that actually admitted that 90% of student gains in test scores was attributable to factors completely outside the control of teachers. Okay, this report just came out in August, I think. The same report documents that there is a statistical error rate of 25% when using 3 years worth of test data. And that error rate grows to 35% when we only use 1 year's worth of test data. In other words, when statisticians and policymakers attempt to link individual teachers to the improvement or decline of test scores, they are only accurate 65% of the time when they use test scores for 1 year. And then it only increases to 75% with 3 years. Can you imagine making a medical diagnosis based on 25 or 35%? Other research has found that 50 to 80% of an increase or decrease in student test scores on any given day can be explained by what they call one-time, non-recurring random factors. And what I mean by that is test scores can fluctuate, gains or losses. 50% of that fluctuation can be explained by whether or not a child ate breakfast on the test day, if the window was open when they're taking the test and a dog was barking outside, whether or not they got into an argument with their parents or their peers on the way to school, who happened to be in attendance when they took the test, or whoever happened to be proctoring that test. All those factors actually contribute up to 50 to 80% of any gains or declines in scores. Other analyses have pointed out that test scores for the same teachers are wildly inconsistent year to year. So Dan, as you referred to, there's some studies that have shown that one study, for instance, found that more than 2/3 of the bottom-ranked teachers 1 year had moved out of the bottom ranks the next year, while similarly, the same study found that only 1/3 of the teachers who ranked the highest 1 year retained that top ranking, and a whole third of those teachers bounced to the lower section the next year. And so what you see is these wild fluctuations from year to year with the same teachers. And you would think, well, these are quote-unquote good teachers, they're going to equal higher test scores. But guess what? Year to year, that doesn't happen. A recent policy brief published by the Economic Policy Institute also highlights a problem with what's called non-random assignment of students, either within schools through tracking or across schools by race and economic class. And that this kind of grouping greatly influences tests. We can put it a little differently and say that test performance correlates strongly with race, class, and access to resources. This correlation means that low-performing students are often grouped together, and high-performing students are also grouped together. Such grouping potentially penalizes teachers for low test scores, regardless of how effective they may be as teachers, and that further points to the inaccuracy of the tests. Now, I'm doing this, I'm not even including, there's cognitive arguments to make against testing and their inaccuracy, and there's also what non-school factors